Hi, welcome to the Toronto Daily News for Friday, the 18th January. So the Toronto Women's March is going to start on Saturday, Nathan Phillips Square, end up at University. The march is from 1 to 3. A new women's shelter is also opening up this weekend. This is by the YMCA. It's going to be at Davenport and DuPont. A memorial was held for Bruce McArthur's victims 1 year after his arrest. It could be one more year before he goes to trial. A Thursday night machete attack has left a brother in a hospital. The other brother was the assailant. Global has run a horror story about H1N1 to promote vaccination. Trump's lies about Russia and his instructions to others to repeat those lies have finally caught up with him, and he's now a totally impeachable traitor. Doug Ford wants a casino so badly on the waterfront that we might end up having one there, and then going through city property to get to it. Gambling is illegal on city property. Global, it's an outside chance, but that's how it would. You would have to walk through an area where gambling is illegal to go to the casino, where it's probably still illegal too, because you can't gamble in Toronto, but because it's provincial anyway. Global and CTV pretend homeless people are getting killed because they're not visible enough. Says while they're covering the sashes that some outreach workers have been giving to homeless people, inspired by the woman who was run over recently by a garbage truck while sleeping on a sewer grate. So apparently she wasn't visible enough. As if homeless people have no reason for wanting to avoid drawing attention to themselves. CTV, in their coverage of a car accident, pretends that this SUV accelerated into 7 pedestrians of its own accord on a crosswalk at a three-way intersection, and worded their report as if the driver was a bystander, as they typically do. New changes to Ontario's careless driving laws, and this is what she was charged with, in September of last year, have dramatically escalated the fines and jail time that somebody can potentially receive for dangerous driving, and introduce this for drivers who are causing injury or death. And it actually came with an admission from policymakers that the problem of drivers, dangerous drivers, getting away with one basically vehicular assault after another with quote unquote a slap on the wrist. A Torontonian has been arrested in connection with a terrorist attack in Kenya, apparently sponsored by Al-Shabaab. Global News wants us all to know that tradespeople are not dumb, and that trades are not just where you put troublesome students, and that DIY renos and under-certified fly-by-night contractors can definitely be sketchy. And while the evening news from Global and CTV were obsessing over making homeless people more visible by giving them reflective sashes, CBC Metro Morning covered a rally that was held by poverty activists in the alley in which this woman was run over by a dump truck, which inspired those sashes because all she needed was to be reflective so that anyone cruising around could easily find her as a homeless person. So the CBC interviewed outreach worker Kathy Crow, who explains why people should be allowed to continue to live in makeshift shelters instead of being evicted from them at the coldest time of the year over safety concerns about propane heaters causing fires and stuff like that. So I've got two editorializations, one about terrorism, the other about tenancy. Terrorism, if you are looking at it as a tool of political activism, that's one set of considerations. But terrorism as part of asymmetrical warfare is just a warfare attack, or a counterattack or whatever. Unfortunately, Canada has been connected with a whole bunch of war crimes, and also our pollution profiteering internationally has made us a lot of enemies. And warfare is about taking risks by being careful about who you make an enemy out of. And so as part of a war between a population that has a big, powerful official army, formal army, and a population that doesn't, as part of that situation, if that population that doesn't have an army decides that they've what's been done to them constitutes an act of war, and they need to participate in the war for the same reasons that states will fight back against each other. So like, well, okay, you can't invade this place, and to remind you of that, we're going to invade this place. The same thing is what happens with the asymmetrical warfare. So and this is part of terrorism that the press just doesn't discuss, and politicians typically don't discuss either. They want to discuss it as if it's always a tool of political pressure, but it's also part of warfare. It's part of asymmetrical warfare, and it's part of what happens when a big powerful country decides, well, this other place doesn't have a big powerful army to resist us, so maybe we can get away with some dirty dealings there, and it won't be considered war. But sometimes it is. Sometimes it is considered war by the population that's there, and sometimes they decide to engage in warfare. And if they don't have an official army, then the attacks that they do will end up being terrorism one way or the other. So I want to suggest that people think of terrorism as those two different things. It can be an element of some kind of activism, but it can also be an element of warfare, of asymmetrical warfare. The other thing that I wanted to editorialize on was tenancy. And so we've got all sorts of unused bits of land all over the city. We've got all sorts of people who are without shelter and are at risk of dying. And we can't have shacks. And shacks are fine. Canadians basically exist because for generations we went through the winter in makeshift, cabins and shacks and stuff heated by fire. And by making that whole situation totally unacceptable, and then also making tenancy so challenging and making the housing stock so short, that's what we get, a housing problem. But in the press, what we end up getting is these sort of vague allusions to people having a hard time maintaining tenancy. But tenancy is difficult to maintain. So it's not just that you have to have a bare minimum of being able to take care of a place and being an okay neighbor. we've also got a very narrow range of what that means. So there's very little housing available. That there's a whole bunch of people whose needs are not very demanding, but they're just not provided for. And the homelessness situation is just so much bigger than it would ever have to be, because there's this whole chunk of housing missing. And I think part of it is we need to get imaginative about creating new sort of formats for cheap living in the city, physical formats that that work for people's needs, who are not being able to fit into the roommate situation, the rooming house situation, the bachelor / one bedroom situation, because all of those situations are so challenging. They all have these extreme social challenges that tons and tons of people can't meet. And to remove those challenges is kind of a challenge in itself, but it's not impossible. I want to suggest that it's not impossible. And we are so far away from finding out how possible it is, because we've decided we have a very narrow acceptable range for the conditions that people are allowed to live in, and we're not willing to provide those conditions universally. So if your plan is to make it illegal to live in sketchy little cabins, and the other part of your plan is to just not provide what you think people should be living in to everyone, then there needs to be a plan for a whole bunch of people just scattered, because they're just not good enough tenants and they're just not good enough campers to deal with the situation. And that includes a hell of a lot of people. For the daily news, this is Dorian Sky. Have a fantastic Saturday. Have fun at Queen's Park